Margaret had planned every word of her response for months, not because she was vengeful by nature, not because she enjoyed confrontation or drama or the particular theater of public moments gone wrong, but because she had learned, slowly, painfully, and with extraordinary precision, that some people only understand consequences when those consequences arrive in front of an audience. She was 31 years old, standing in a beautifully decorated event space in Denver, Colorado, holding a glass of champagne she had not yet touched, listening to her own mother's voice carry across the room. The words came clearly through the music and the laughter and the clinking of glasses: failure. Her mother said it like it was simply an observation. Casual, conversational, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret had worked 3 jobs to rebuild what her parents had taken. She had rebuilt her future dollar by dollar, decision by decision, in complete silence. While her parents attended dinner parties and described her as their greatest disappointment, she set her champagne glass down slowly, reached into her clutch. And everything her parents thought they had buried, every document, every transfer, every carefully hidden transaction, was about to surface in the most public way imaginable. They stole $127,000 her grandparents spent 20 years saving, then walked into her engagement party and called her a failure. Margaret had been quietly preparing for that moment for a very long time. If you've ever had to rebuild what someone else destroyed, subscribe right now. What she did next, you cannot miss it. My name is Margaret. I was 31 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, and if you had known me at 18, you would have known exactly what my future looked like. Medical school, a career in medicine, a life built around the thing I had loved since I was old enough to understand what doctors actually did for people. That dream was not something my parents planted in me to satisfy their own ambitions. It was genuinely, entirely mine. I had carried it carefully through every exam, every late night, every sacrifice that serious academic pursuit requires. It was real, it was earned, and someone had quietly, methodically decided it was theirs to spend. My maternal grandparents, Harold and Estelle, were not wealthy people. They were careful people. The distinction matters enormously. Over 20 years, they set aside money specifically, intentionally, and exclusively for my medical education. Birthday by birthday. Holiday by holiday. Small, consistent deposits into an account they opened when I was 3 years old and built steadily until it held $127,000. They told me about it when I turned 16, sat me down at their kitchen table, showed me the statements, and told me that my education would never be the reason I couldn't become a doctor. Harold passed the year I turned 18. Estelle 2 years later. The fund was transferred to my parents for management. That was the last decision anyone made correctly. My parents were the kind of people who looked exactly right from every external angle. Victor, tall, professionally polished, the sort of man who knew which fork to use and always remembered the names of people who might be useful later. Nadine, elegant, socially precise, the architect of every impression their family made in public. They belonged to the right clubs, attended the right events, maintained the right friendships. What nobody outside our house knew was that the life they presented required considerably more money than they actually had. They were not corrupt people by nature, but they were people who had developed a very comfortable relationship with financial decisions they never intended to explain. I need to be clear about something. Medicine was not a status symbol for me. It was not about the title or the income or the particular social weight a medical degree carries in certain circles. I had known since I was 9 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room, watching a doctor speak to a frightened family with such steady human care, that this was what I wanted to do with my life. I studied with that image in mind every single day. I gave up things other young women my age took for granted: social hours, relationships, ordinary rest, because the goal on the other side of all that sacrifice felt completely worth every single thing it cost me. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early April. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the email notification came through, and I remember the specific quality of the silence in my apartment in the seconds before I opened it. I had applied to 4 programs. This was my first choice, a respected medical school 40 minutes from where I had grown up, close enough to feel like coming home, rigorous enough to mean everything. I opened the email, read the first sentence, read it again. Then I sat completely still for a very long moment before I allowed myself to feel it. Everything Harold and Estelle had believed about me, everything I had worked toward for over a decade, was now officially real. I called my parents the same evening, excited, grateful, already mentally moving into the next chapter. I told them about the acceptance. My mother's response was warm and rehearsed in equal measure. My father congratulated me with the particular pride of a man who planned to take credit for outcomes he had observed from a comfortable distance. Then I mentioned the tuition transfer, the practical next step, the reason the fund existed, the moment 20 years of Harold and Estelle's careful saving was supposed to become my future. There was a pause on the line. Brief, almost imperceptible. But I had grown up listening to my father's pauses, and I knew immediately that this one carried something heavy inside it. It took 3 conversations over 2 weeks before my father said it plainly. The fund was gone. Not partially depleted, gone. Closed. The money had been withdrawn in incremental transfers over 4 years and absorbed into their personal accounts under the description of temporary borrowing. He used that phrase carefully, temporary borrowing, as though the language softened the architecture of what had actually happened. He said they had always intended to repay it. He said circumstances had made that difficult. He said he was sorry in the tone of a man, apologizing for a minor inconvenience rather than the systematic dismantling of his daughter's future. I held the phone against my ear and said nothing for a very long time. 3 years passed between the phone call that ended my first medical school journey and the evening that changed everything else. 3 years of rebuilding in silence while my parents continued attending dinner parties and describing their family to acquaintances with the practiced ease of people who had completely rewritten their own history. They never mentioned the fund in conversation after that initial call. Never referenced the transfers. Never acknowledged that the daughter they introduced as their great academic hope had spent those 3 years working multiple jobs to reconstruct a future they had quietly dismantled. I let them maintain that silence. I had my own reasons for not disrupting it yet. I was still building something they didn't know about. I met Thomas at a hospital administrative conference in downtown Denver. He was there representing a construction firm contracted for a new medical facility. I was there representing the administrative department I had been working in since deferring school. He was straightforward and genuinely kind in a way that had nothing performative about it. On our third date, I told him everything: the fund, the transfers, the deferred dream, the 3 jobs, the quiet rebuilding. I watched his face while I talked. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer uncomfortable reassurances or try to minimize what I was describing. He just listened completely. Then he said, "Margaret, that is the most clarifying thing anyone has ever told me about themselves on a third date." I knew then. Thomas proposed on a Sunday morning in our apartment. Simple, private, exactly right. When we began planning the engagement party, we made one decision together without much discussion. We would invite everyone. His family, my family, our closest friends, colleagues who had become genuine people in our lives. I did not consider excluding my parents. That might seem surprising given everything. But I had been preparing for a specific moment for a long time, and that moment required an audience. I chose the venue carefully: a beautiful event space in central Denver, warm lighting, good acoustics, the kind of room where conversations carry naturally from one end to the other. Every detail was intentional, including the document folded inside my clutch. My parents arrived 40 minutes into the party, Victor in a suit that announced itself, Nadine in a dress she had clearly selected to be remembered. They worked the room immediately and naturally, the way people do when social performance is their primary fluency. Victor shook hands with Thomas's father for slightly too long. Nadine kissed cheeks and admired the venue with the enthusiasm of someone mentally cataloging details to describe later. They greeted me warmly, the particular warmth of people performing parenthood for an audience, and I received it without expression and without comment. I watched them move through the room. Watched them construct themselves, in real time, into the version of parents they needed people in this room to believe they were. It happened near the center of the room, approximately 90 minutes into the evening. Nadine was speaking to a cluster of guests that included 2 of Thomas's colleagues, my closest friend Rachel, and an aunt who had known our family for decades. I was close enough to hear clearly. The conversation had moved to careers and futures, the natural territory of engagement party small talk. And then Nadine, voice warm and carrying, tilted her head in my direction and said it with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Margaret never quite lived up to what we always hoped for her. Such potential, it's just a shame how things turned out." She said it like an observation, like weather, like it was simply true. I watched it happen in real time, the particular ripple that moves through a social gathering when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Thomas went completely still beside me. Rachel's expression shifted from relaxed to sharp in under a second. Thomas's colleague looked suddenly uncertain about where to direct his eyes. My aunt's face did something complicated: the collision of loyalty, shock, and the particular discomfort of someone who has just witnessed a private family wound open publicly without warning. Nobody laughed, nobody agreed, Nobody offered Nadine the social validation she had delivered that comment expecting. The room simply held it, suspended and uncomfortable, while everyone waited to see what would happen next. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table. Slowly, deliberately. The way you set something down when you need both hands free, and you need everyone around you to notice that you have made a decision. I reached into my clutch and felt the folded document between my fingers. The same document I had placed there 3 hours earlier when I was getting dressed. The same one I had carried to 4 previous family events and chosen not to use, waiting for the moment that was specific enough, public enough, and honest enough to deserve it. Tonight, Nadine had just handed me that moment herself. I unfolded the document carefully, looked up at the room, and began to speak. I need to take you back, because what happened at that engagement party only makes sense when you understand what the 3 years before it actually looked like. The night my father finally confirmed the fund was gone, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea that went completely cold beside me. I pulled up every bank statement my parents had reluctantly forwarded over the previous 2 weeks. I read through every page twice, then a third time. The transfers were systematic, small enough individually to seem manageable, frequent enough collectively to tell a story of deliberate, sustained withdrawal. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark, and gave myself exactly 48 hours to fall apart completely. 48 hours later, I stood in my kitchen, made coffee, and opened a fresh document on my laptop. Not a journal, not a letter to my parents, a plan. I wrote down everything I knew, the total amount missing, the approximate timeline of withdrawals, the account closure date my father had mentioned in passing like it was a minor administrative detail. Then I wrote down everything I needed to find out. Then I wrote down, in a separate column, every resource I currently had available to me. It was a short list, but it was honest. And I had learned, sitting in enough hospital waiting rooms during my administrative work, that an honest assessment of available resources is always the correct place to begin. The first job was my hospital administrative position. Steady, reliable health benefits included, a paycheck that covered rent and basic expenses. The second was online tutoring, pre-med students mostly, which carried its own particular emotional weight that I chose to treat as motivation rather than irony. The third was freelance medical transcription work I picked up through a professional network, evenings, weekends, whatever hours remained after the first two. I did not tell my parents about the second and third jobs. I did not post about exhaustion on social media or seek sympathy from mutual acquaintances. I deposited every extra dollar into a separate savings account and watched the number grow with the focused satisfaction of someone building something that cannot be taken because nobody knows it exists. A colleague at the hospital mentioned her name in passing, Claire Hendricks, a financial attorney with specific experience in civil recovery cases. I made the appointment without telling anyone. I sat across from Claire on a Tuesday afternoon and laid out the complete picture: the fund, its origins, the transfer timeline, the account closure, my father's description of it as temporary borrowing. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, she pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing. She explained the distinction between informal family financial arrangements and legally recoverable misappropriation of designated funds. She explained what documentation would be needed. She explained the realistic timeline and probable outcomes. I listened to every word with the attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for a clear path forward. Over the following 8 months, I built the case file with the same methodical attention I had once given to exam preparation. Bank statements obtained through formal request. The original fund documentation Harold and Estelle had created, found in a box of their belongings my mother had given me years earlier without realizing what it contained. Email correspondence with my father from the period when I first began asking questions, carefully printed, dated, and organized. A written timeline Claire helped me construct that mapped every documented withdrawal against my parents' known expenses during the same period. The file grew steadily, quietly, in a folder on my laptop that I backed up in 3 separate locations. My parents called occasionally during those months. I answered warmly, said very little, and kept building. 14 months after discovering the fund was gone, I reapplied to medical school. Same program. Different application, stronger actually, because it now included 3 years of hospital administrative experience that gave my personal statement a grounded clinical perspective my first application had lacked. The acceptance came on a Wednesday morning. I read it at my desk between transcription assignments, allowed myself 30 seconds of private celebration, then forwarded it to Claire and to Thomas, the only 2 people who knew the complete picture. Claire responded with a single line. Now we have a timeline. Thomas drove to my apartment that evening with dinner and said nothing for a long time, just sat beside me with the quiet, solid presence of someone who understood exactly what this moment had cost and exactly what it meant. Medical school's first year was the hardest thing I had ever done, and I had spent 3 years working 3 jobs simultaneously, so that statement carries genuine weight. I attended every lecture, completed every assignment, absorbed every clinical concept with the focus of someone who understood precisely what each hour of education had cost to make possible. Meanwhile, the case file continued growing on my laptop. Claire filed the preliminary documentation quietly, without fanfare, keeping everything below my parents' awareness. By the time Thomas proposed, I was 6 months into my first year. The legal groundwork was fully laid, and the document I would eventually carry in my clutch on the night of our engagement party had been printed, folded, and ready for 3 months. I was simply waiting for the right moment. The room was still holding Nadine's comment in that particular suspended silence, the kind that exists in the seconds after something publicly inappropriate has been said, and nobody has yet decided how to respond. I looked at the document in my hands. It was a single printed page, a clean, organized summary Claire had helped me prepare, distilling 18 months of case file documentation into one precise, readable account. Total fund amount, withdrawal timeline, account closure date. My parents' names on every transaction. I had not planned to use it as a dramatic gesture. I had planned to use it as the truth, delivered clearly, in a room full of witnesses, on a night my mother had just made unavoidable. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room had already gone quiet enough that when I began speaking, every person in it heard me clearly from the first word. I said I wanted to share something about my journey before the evening continued, that since my mother had just referenced my potential and where it had led, it felt like the right moment to provide some context. I spoke the way I had rehearsed, not robotically, but with the calm of someone who has lived inside a truth for long enough that delivering it requires no performance whatsoever. Thomas stood beside me, steady, hands at his sides, eyes forward. His presence behind my shoulder felt like the clearest possible definition of the word partner. I told them about my grandparents first. I wanted the room to understand what the fund actually was before I explained what had happened to it. I described Harold and Estelle, their carefulness, their consistency, the 20 years of small, deliberate deposits that had built something real and specific and loving. I told them that my grandparents had sat me down at their kitchen table when I was 16 and showed me the statements and told me my education would never be the reason I couldn't become a doctor. I watched faces around the room as I spoke, Thomas's family absorbing this for the first time, my aunt's expression shifting from discomfort into something rawer, several of my parents' friends becoming very still. Then I presented the document. I didn't hand it around the room, I simply held it and read from it clearly. The opening balance, the first withdrawal date, the pattern of transfers over 4 years, the account closure. The total amount removed, $127,000, stated plainly without dramatic emphasis because the number required none. I cited the specific legal characterization Claire had documented misappropriation of designated educational funds. I noted that formal civil proceedings had already been initiated. Every figure I cited was sourced. Every date was verified. Every word on that page had been reviewed by an attorney and confirmed accurate. My parents could not dispute a single line of it, not because they lacked the impulse, but because the documentation made disputing it impossible. My father moved first. He took 2 steps toward me with his hands slightly raised, the gesture of a man attempting to physically manage a situation that has escaped his control. His voice came out measured but strained, telling the room this was a private family matter, that figures were being misrepresented, that this was neither the time nor the place. It was, I noticed, the same voice he had used when I first asked him about the fund, controlled, slightly wounded, designed to make the person asking the question feel they had done something wrong simply by asking it. Thomas stepped forward quietly, not aggressively, simply forward, placing himself in the space between my father's movement and where I was standing. Victor stopped. I looked back at the room and finished. I told them that the woman Nadine had just described as never quite living up to her potential had worked 3 jobs for 3 years to rebuild what had been taken. She had reapplied to medical school independently, funded it herself through savings and scholarships, and was currently completing her first year. That she had done all of this in complete silence while her parents attended social gatherings and described her as their greatest disappointment. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I folded the document once, returned it to my clutch, and looked directly at my mother. Nadine was standing completely still, the social composure she had maintained her entire life visibly, publicly and irreversibly gone. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it broke not into chaos, but into the low, unmistakable sound of a room processing something it cannot unfeel. Thomas's mother reached for my hand. Rachel made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a word. Two of my parents' closest friends, people who had known Victor and Nadine for over 15 years, looked at them with expressions that no amount of subsequent dinner party conversation would ever fully erase. My father stood with his jaw tight and his hands at his sides. My mother looked at the floor. The room they had walked into 40 minutes ago performing the role of proud parents no longer existed. What replaced it was honest. And honesty, once it fills a room completely, cannot be asked to leave. Claire filed the formal civil case the Monday morning after the engagement party. The filing incorporated 18 months of meticulously assembled documentation, bank records, the original fund paperwork Harold and Estelle had created, the email correspondence with my father, the complete withdrawal timeline mapped against my parents' known financial activity during the same period. Additionally, Claire included something that strengthened the filing considerably: written statements from 3 guests who had been present at the engagement party and had witnessed both Nadine's public comment and my subsequent presentation of the documented evidence. My parents' behavior that evening, combined with the paper trail Claire had built over 18 months, created a case that was precise, comprehensive, and extraordinarily difficult to approach from any angle of defense. My parents retained an attorney within the week, a civil litigator named Patterson, who called Claire's office requesting a preliminary discussion before any formal proceedings advanced. Claire told me about the call with the measured calm of someone who had expected it. We met the following afternoon, and she walked me through the complete picture of where things stood legally. Documentation I had assembled was the kind that makes alternative narratives functionally impossible, not because it was aggressive or inflammatory, but because it was simply accurate. Every figure sourced, every date is verified, every transfer is traceable. Patterson had presumably reviewed the same records his clients had access to and understood immediately what Claire had understood 18 months ago. My parents had no defensible position. The paper trail had seen to that completely. The civil settlement was reached 6 weeks after filing, faster than Claire had initially projected, which she attributed to the particular clarity of the documentation and the absence of any credible counter-argument my parents' representation could construct. The agreement was structured as a formal repayment plan, legally binding, court-supervised, covering the documented fund withdrawals with interest calculated from the date of the first unauthorized transfer. My parents signed it in their attorney's office without requesting a meeting with me beforehand. I was not present for the signing. I was in a gross anatomy lecture when Claire texted me the confirmation. I read it once, put my phone face down on the desk beside me, and returned my attention to the lecture. The work in front of me had always been the point. The extended family conversation happened gradually, and then all at once, the way these things always do when a truth has been made public in a room full of witnesses. My aunt called first, 3 days after the party, and spoke with the careful honesty of someone who had been holding a complicated private assessment for years and finally had permission to express it. Thomas's family asked questions respectfully and without pressure. The friends who had been present at the party, including several my parents had known for decades, quietly recalibrated relationships that would never quite return to their previous configuration. Nobody made dramatic proclamations. Nobody issued public statements. The fracture happened in private conversations, in unreturned calls, in invitations that stopped arriving. Accountability rarely announces itself loudly. It simply rearranges the room. Thomas and I married on a Saturday in late September, small, deliberate, every person in that room chosen specifically, because they had shown up during the years when showing up cost something. Rachel stood beside me. Claire attended as a guest and cried during the vows, which I had not anticipated, and which made me love her considerably more. Thomas's parents sat in the front row with the warm, uncomplicated pride of people who understood exactly what their son had chosen and why. My grandparents were not there in person. Harold had been gone for 13 years, Estelle for 11. But the fund they had built with 20 years of careful saving had ultimately, circuitously, brought me to this exact room. I felt them in every corner of it. I walked across the graduation stage on a Friday afternoon in May, 3 years after that engagement party, 4 years after the night I sat alone with cold tea and bank statements that confirmed everything I had feared. Thomas was in the audience in the 4th row. Rachel beside him. Claire 2 seats over. My white coat had been hanging in my apartment closet for 2 years already, earned at the white coat ceremony that marked the beginning of clinical training. But the diploma I accepted from the dean's hands that afternoon was different. It was the physical, documented, institutional confirmation that Harold and Estelle's belief had been correct all along, that the fund they built had been right about me, that I had simply needed to find a different path to the same destination. So here is what I want to leave with you, directly and without decoration. Someone taking something from you does not mean you are finished. It means the path looks different than you planned. It means the timeline shifts. It means you will spend years doing things in private that you never expected to do, working jobs that exhaust you, building files nobody knows exist, carrying documents in clutches to parties, and waiting for the exact right moment. But here is what those years also give you: a clarity about your own strength that comfortable circumstances never could. They took $127,000. They could not take the work ethic, the patience, or the precision that rebuilt everything they dismantled. Some things once developed belong to you permanently. Build those things, guard those things. Nobody can touch them.